Julian, I've had the great pleasure of reading 2 of your books this week simultaneously. If you are going to be interviewing somebody who has 26 books, it's actually, you have a pretty good chance of reading a couple of them. But in Defense of Partisanship, it took me a minute because we are so embedded in hyper-partisanship. It has just become the air we breathe. Increasingly so, like frogs who've boiled in water. That I think the only place to start is to define the terms. Mm-hmm. What is a responsible partisanship?
Well, to cut to the chase, I define it as strong parties, parties with centralized leadership, and coherent agendas that are distinct, but where leaders and officials abide by certain guardrails. And that can mean certain processes in American politics are off limits in partisan combat, as we had for much of American history, and that leaders think about the repercussions of what they say and how they do their partisan battle, rather than just diving all in. And so the responsibility is, it's almost like a fence around the combatants. But at the same time, I think we need strong parties because I think our electorate calls for that, and they serve a function historically in our very disjointed political system.
Why now?
Why right now?
Why now? I mean, just to place us, I mean, we are 24 hours into the second Trump administration, where more than 1,000 January 6 hostages. I even said J6 hostages because that's how effective he is at communicating, right? Criminals,
he's in your head.
Criminals have been pardoned after bludgeoning police officers and serving time where, the Constitution is being wiped out through executive orders in the context of birthright. So there's all of these sort of impending battles, right? So it almost, the title almost sort of evokes this permission to begin fighting, and that's not what you're talking about.
No, I mean, so you could think of it in 2 ways. What's happening right now and what happened with the pardons is an example of what we can't have, and a kind of partisanship that we have had now several decades of, which has kind of been boiling, and this is a culmination of it. And I'm someone who's argued this isn't all about President Trump. It's a kind of partisanship that has taken hold. On the other hand, people ask, so what should Democrats do? What should kind of an opposition do? And I think partisanship is actually going to be the answer, meaning they become the firewall. The opposition party becomes the firewall to a very aggressive president if the party of the president won't check that person. So I think that's a kind of twin answer for why at this moment this is relevant. And then looking forward, part of this is an intellectual kind of history and argument that going forward, we need to figure out something that works with the system we have but makes it better. And that's more urgent today than ever before.
We're going to get to how we got here. Yep. And the book is a history. I mean, it is a history of parties and how parties have emerged and how, as their power has ebbed and flowed, how has that happened and who have been the key influencers throughout the course of our history. But first, as we continue to sort of define our terms, you write in the beginning, in the introduction, why irresponsible partisanship hurts us.
Yes.
You write, quote, when Democrats and Republicans repeatedly fail to reach agreement on some of the biggest problems of our times, such as gun control, climate change, immigration, it's fair to conclude that the immense gulf separating red from blue causes tremendous harm to real people every day.
Correct. But the kind of next part of that is partisanship itself isn't the reason that the system can't function. We've had moments when parties are very forceful and very different, as we did in the mid-'60s as an example, and they don't lead to a breakdown of the system. So it's the kind of partisanship we have layered on a very intense set of divisions in this country that is bringing us to where we are today.
That's hyper-partisanship.
That's hyper-partisanship.
So your argument is that we can achieve a responsible partisanship, and you delineate sort of what that is, what it looks like, the arguments for having a responsible partnership, partisanship, or strong parties are fourfold. You say, one, parties are a mechanism for bringing forth bold ideas. You say when there is responsible partisanship on both sides, more legislative productivity. A real contrast is offered to voters in a contest of ideas. And finally, you say it stops authoritarianism. How?
Well, let me go through each.
I hear you all laughing.
All very important. Number one, a lot of our big moments in American political history where you have big ideas take hold that reshape the debate, or big moments of legislation, have depended on a very strong party. You don't get Franklin Roosevelt without a very robust Democratic Party in the 1930s. You don't get Ronald Reagan without a reinvigorated and robust and pretty forceful Republican Party in the 1980s. Second, I say that, if you have two teams that are strong teams in a very discordant political system, they're going to have a better time reaching agreements, ironically enough, than watered down, kind of grayish parties that don't stand for much, that don't have many leaders. And on the final, this is an argument a lot of political scientists have been looking at, that in a lot of countries where parties are pretty strong and responsible, they become gatekeepers. So you can think of in the early 1950s, you have Senator Joe McCarthy comes about and makes his way up through the Republican Party, but ultimately he is contained, checked, and stopped. Senator McCarthy doesn't become, by his own party, he doesn't become the leader of the Republican Party. He's ultimately an outcast. And that's a function we've seen when parties are actually in good shape. They can serve as that filter because they want to win. And they kind of create mechanisms to contain some of that. And obviously, right now, many would feel we have lost that in the Republican Party. But that's what I'm talking about, and that's the kind of argument I'm drawing on.
Okay. So how we got here, and you start really with the founding generation. Of course, we know that George Washington's farewell address warned us of challenges that we would face in upholding a representative government. And one of those fears or forewarnings that he had was about faction, and excessive faction. So it sounds like you have a quibble with Washington and with Madison.
Yeah, I mean, James Madison, I have lots of great quotes in the book about the dangers and fears of division. Ironically, as soon as we start the country, parties start to form. James Madison and James Madison himself is part of the formation of a party. So you see very early in the history, regardless of the idea, which is a fine idea, it doesn't really work in the US political system. So by the first decades of the Republic, the factions that the founders feared are in place. The parties are starting to form, including through some of the people who warned us most aggressively about faction.
But it still is a productive force. Do you characterize it as a productive force in those founding generations, really up until, well, I mean, the first section of the book really deals up until you get to the 1930s, or 1830s rather.
Yeah, until the party system breaks down and can't handle the problem of slavery, it becomes very important force in shaping the new republic and shaping how the democracy is unfolding. And I mean, interestingly, after the Civil War, the party system doesn't break down. It actually comes back and gets much stronger in the late 19th century as people like Woodrow Wilson are writing about why we need parties in this country. You have advocates for parties that contrast with the founders.
So how does the party system, this partisanship correctly imagined, work properly in the early days of the Republic prior to the breakdown to the Civil War?
Well, I think, look, some of the arguments of Woodrow Wilson are actually very helpful in describing it. He writes a book in 1885 called Congressional Government. He's a young political scientist. He went to Johns Hopkins, and he comes out and he says, we have this system that is, it's by design, layered and fragmented and disjointed, and one of the things parties do is they create communication between Congress, the president, even state and local government. And when he's writing this, you're seeing that happen. You're seeing parties take hold in cities. You're seeing much more strong partisanship on Capitol Hill. You're seeing speakers who are pretty forceful, like a guy named Thomas Reed and Joe Cannon. And the party system is creating some of that coherence as he's calling for more of it. And that's part of how the government is starting to kind of respond through party to some of the problems of industrialization, urbanization, the problems of modernity. It requires a strong Republican Party, frankly, to start taking those on.
But ultimately, the progressives want to weaken the party system.
So the history, so you have this 19th century flourishing of a strong party system, and progressives do weaken it. They implement reforms, from civil service reforms to creating more nonpartisan commissions. In Congress, the power of the party leaders starts to get weakened so that committee leaders are much more autonomous and influential. And that goes really through the 1960s.
And talk about how, so is it the case then that prior to the Civil War and then after the Civil War, that as the business of government becomes more complex, that the committee structure in the Congress creates its own set of power centers that then become organizing devices for partisan power?
Yeah, I mean, it's not automatic, but in the 19th century, that's when Congress creates all these committees everyone's familiar with. It wasn't part of the Constitution. So you have a committee on Ways and Means to handle taxes, committee on appropriations to handle spending. And those committees don't have to be autonomous. They can be basically, as we have today, the leader of the party has control over who's going to be the chair of each committee, what they're going to focus on, what issues they're going to deal with. It's really in the late 30s that the modern system, the system of autonomous committee chairs takes hold. You have these committees and a coalition, a bipartisan coalition of Southern Democrats and Republicans take hold of that system, and they have a lot of autonomy from any party leader to do whatever they want.
And is that a period of what you would call responsible partisanship?
Well, yes. It's responsible in that the basic procedures of government are not weaponized by most members of the party. There are norms that leaders have to abide, but bipartisanship itself becomes the problem. And the fact they're working against their parties, meaning Southern Democrats and Republicans working against what more and more Democrats want, that's the problem.
Okay, so I want to unpack this because I think there's a narrative out there today, which is that, gosh, as we are in this hyper-partisan era and we look back at the 1940s, the 1950s, and 1960s, there was so much cooperation. There was so much bipartisanship. You didn't have as much ideology in Congress. In fact, you had conservative Republicans and liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats. And you actually blow this narrative to pieces.
Well, I started my career writing a book about a guy named Wilbur Mills. Laugh. And for younger people, he was involved in one of the biggest political scandals in congressional history.
Oh, tell the story, please.
So he was the chairman of the Ways and Means. He was one of these Southern Democrats that a lot of liberal reformers really disliked because basically they didn't allow the party to move forward on civil rights. He's powerful for decades, helps create Medicare, in charge of income taxes, et cetera, et cetera. And on 1974 in October, one night, some reporters hear the police radio, and someone's speeding near the tidal base in a car, a Lincoln Continental. They go to see what it is. Lo and behold, a woman runs out of the Lincoln Continental, jumps into the tidal base, and an older man, which is him, runs after her. He's inebriated. And her name is Anibal Batisteja, better known as the Argentine firecracker, she's a stripper in Washington.
She's a dancer.
So it becomes a huge scandal, and it's an interesting scandal because it ultimately allows reformers, in part, to get at this issue. For them, people like Wilbur Mills, put aside the scandal, he's deposed from power a little later, they used bipartisanship to actually stop momentum on some of the biggest issues of the day. You couldn't get civil rights, not because we had too much partisanship, but because this coalition refused to listen to where a majority of the Democratic Party was going. They would hold bills. They would not let bills come up for a vote. You look at almost any civil rights organization in the 50s and 60s, it's this bipartisan coalition that they were so frustrated. So I started my career looking at this era where bipartisanship was the last thing anyone venerated, and you could see some of the costs. It kind of watered down what the parties were about to a point of frustration.
So this halcyon era of bipartisanship is actually a bipartisan collaboration between between sort of old school American racism standing up against civil rights progress.
Absolutely. I mean, that was the story of that era. And liberal presidents, for sure, such as a Lyndon Johnson, have to devote a lot of their time to how do you break the power of this coalition. And this all kind of explodes, so to speak, in the 1970s, in part with a scandal like Mills. But that's when you move away from that bipartisanship.
If only a congressman and a stripper could derail an entire
That's an older era, right.
All right, so prior to that, though, I mean, and by the way, we have like gone over very, very quickly 150 years of congressional history and partisanship. So you all will read the gory details in the book, which are actually fascinating. But I don't, because you spend enough time on this, I don't want to gloss over the 1950 APSA report.
Yeah.
So this is a report on responsible partisanship that is generated from the Association of American Political Scientists, reflecting on this halcyon era in the 1950s.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting report, and it was a report from the political scientists. It gains a lot of attention. It's reported on in the media. There's an era where experts were respected and treated pretty well.
Outside of the historical.
So that's why I wanted to write, yeah. But it's a report. They look deeply at how does the party system work, and their complaint is that the parties aren't strong enough. They're frustrated with what they see as this bipartisan watering down of the political process. And so they call, in this report, for much stronger parties, a little like Woodrow Wilson did many decades earlier. They actually call for the creation of an uber committee of party leaders that will decide what's the kind of agenda for the party, and everyone has to follow it. In Congress, they'd have rules where the speaker can appoint committee chairs who will be loyal to whatever the party wants. So if you want to push for civil rights, a committee leader from Mississippi couldn't say, sorry, they were going to have to do it or they would lose that seat. And the report is really important to a whole generation, not just of academics, but of younger legislators, including people like Hubert Humphrey, who are reading this and who are seeing this and who are all very much engaged in a project for the next 2 decades, where the point, which sounds odd today, was to have stronger parties. Responsible partisanship for them is different than me. Meaning in that era, what they were calling for were party leaders who were responsible to the majority of the party rather than the dictates of a small number of committee chairs who reflected the 19th century rather than the 20th.
And yet, all of the strength of the parties is actually a function of their expression in the Congress. Mm-hmm. Why? I mean, because when we think of our parties now, I mean, we often, I mean, we have challenges with parties in Congress. We have these super PACs. We have the national parties. We have the president's role within the context of the parties. I mean, and yet the history of your book is about the Congress and parties in the context of the Congress.
I mean, two answers. For me, I'm fascinated with Congress, always have been, and I believe ultimately that's where the dysfunction and the function of our democracy plays out most clearly. That's where all the divisions we have and the points of agreement have to work out in an actual process. So I've always been a Congress person, and I think it's the institution we pay least attention to right through today. For that 1950 report, the answer was pretty straightforward, and others wrote about it. They basically saw we had a country with 4 parties. We had a Democratic presidential party, a Republican presidential party, and they reflected where the parties were nationally. And then you had the Congressional Republican Party and the Congressional Democratic Party. They didn't represent where most of the country is. So a lot of reform was essentially how do you break that 4-way system. A guy named James McGregor Burns in the 1960s wrote a book, The Deadlock of Democracy, that continues this line of argument. So they were focused on Congress, and I am too. And I still believe today that ultimately That's where the mechanisms of party need to be worked out, because that's where the decision-making takes place.
You referenced McCarthy and the Republican Party in McCarthy's era being the check on him and policing his exchange and providing the guardrail. What happened in the Watergate era?
Yeah, so, I mean, the Watergate era, you see that play out again. I mean, the most, for me, impactful moment of Watergate, there's many of them, but one is the final days when you have the Republican leaders, including Senator Barry Goldwater, approach Richard Nixon with President Nixon with the decision and the message: if you stay, the Senate will vote to remove you should the House send articles of impeachment. So that's still the era, I think, where we're seeing a party that can serve that gatekeeper role. I mean, Nixon doesn't leave if they don't do that. Nixon does not leave if his own party doesn't say, you're done. That was the reason, ultimately, he gives in.
So the functioning of the parties changes after Watergate.
Yeah.
You you call them the Watergate babies, this sort of generation of legislators that comes in after Watergate. How do the parties change after Watergate?
So the 1970s is really a high water mark. This is when we have much stronger parties, centralized parties form in Congress, a little like what I'm talking about, where the leadership has power. And a key moment, they pass all kinds of reforms, technical reforms that matter in Washington. For example, in 1971, the Democrats passed a rule which said, rather than giving every old committee chairman the chairmanship automatically, we have the power to vote on a person and say, sorry, you're not doing what the party needs. But they don't use that until after Watergate. The country's angry, the country's frustrated. There's a sense the leadership has failed this country. So one thing that happens in January of 1975, it's a dramatic moment in Washington. Now it's not so dramatic because we live in a much more dramatic era. But basically, the House Democrats, all these Watergate babies, Henry Waxman of California and others, they tell every senior committee chair, who are older men, many of whom are Southerners, you have to appear before us in a room like this, and we'd be the committee chairs, and the freshmen would ask them questions. Are you going to support civil rights? Are you going to support the environmental agenda, et cetera, et cetera? And they depose three of them. Three of them don't give the right answers, and they make an example of them, and they say, you're out of a job. And that's a dramatic thing to do. And then separately, they tell Wilbur Mills, who, after the scandal I told you, got reelected, but then when Fannie Fox has her first appearance in Boston at a strip club, the media's there, so it'll be a kind of watered-down version. He stumbles on stage drunk and pulls her off, and this is in November. And after that, the House Democrats say, okay, Wilbur Mills, the most powerful of all the committee chairmen, you're gone. And they take away power from the Ways and Means Committee, which was really the center of committee power, and put it in the arms of the Speaker and the Majority Leader. So through those stories, through those dramas, the parties end up by the late 70s in Congress much more forceful kind of mechanisms and bodies.
Okay, so I know where we are now. I know how you feel about Newt Gingrich, and now we're basically at the beginning of the Reagan era.
Yeah.
So can you give us sort of the next 40 years?
Yep.
Sort of what happens?
Speed history.
What
That's
happens?
What
No, because we want to get to questions,
Yeah.
and there are cards coming around, and we want to get to questions. But this is the part that we're all familiar with. We've all lived through. So as an academic, what happens in Congress that we end up where we are now?
So I'll move us through. So the 1970s, again, you have the parties become much more strong, coherent, and concentrated up top rather than decentralized. You also have voters sort, as we hear in the 70s and 80s. So Southerners move from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and liberal Northeastern Republicans will start to diminish. So by the 90s, you have the red-blue map generally that we've become very accustomed to. And those work together in Congress. And then you have two things happen, I argue, between the 90s and today, which move us into a place that has been destructive. One, I do talk about the Republican Party. It's not an equal problem in terms of partisanship.
Let's talk about asymmetric polarization.
Asymmetric.
Define it and how we got it.
It basically means that Republicans moved further to the right in the leadership than Democrats moved to the left. And equally important, they become much more ferocious, the leadership, a no guardrail type of partisan battle than Democrats were willing to accept. And I don't think this is just norms and even ethics. Democrats are a party that depends on government. And so ultimately there are checks on how far you could go, where Republican Party politics revolved around an anti-government ethos, so you could go much farther. So I trace it from Newt Gingrich in the 80s and 90s to the Tea Party, to the MAGA Republicans, that I think are an arc for the party that have moved Congress in a very different direction.
So you talk also about the power, or sort of the role that, that money in politics and fundraising plays, especially in the Gingrich era.
Yeah.
And that's its role in partisanship, hyperpartisanship.
Yeah.
Why does that play a role in the asymmetry, the sort of the increasing asymmetry between the polarization of the parties?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the money comes increasingly from single interest groups, single issue interest groups. They have one issue, they align with the party that supports that issue. And a lot of the social scientists have looked at it and just see that, like today podcasting is discussed, Republicans are getting a lot more of that money on some high profile issues, from abortion to gun rights. And so that money is pushing the party in that direction because you don't want to lose the money. And Democrats are not quite as successful with that kind of money. So that's where I combine those two forces.
This is the time we first see fights about the debt limit?
Yeah. So that's an example of what I'm talking about, where you have partisan battles, which are, I think, pretty familiar, and the system can deal with it. Then you come to the Tea Party in 2011, and all of a sudden, a really routine procedure, which, if not done, meaning you have Congress accept to pay what they've accepted to pay. If they don't do it, you send the country into default. So the ramifications are severe, and occasionally a member had threatened not to do it, but it had never been seriously considered as plausible. It was grandstanding. You have with the Tea Party a very serious moment in 2011 and again 13, where this is on the table to try to extract budget cuts from President Obama at that point. And so that's an example of where all of a sudden a very routine procedure becomes weaponized with incredible consequence had that happen. And it's become now a normative part of politics. Now people don't even notice when we have these debates, as we just did, over that possibility. So that's an example of what I'm talking about.
Another tool of the hyperpartisan warfare is the use of the filibuster?
Yep. Yes, and I see it that, that's an area of disagreement. For many, the filibuster is a kind of model of how you get bipartisan agreement, but I don't think since the 70s that's how it's actually played out. It's become a very routine tool. We now have a 60-vote supermajority requirement in the Senate, which gives the minority power essentially the power to block everything. And that is ultimately not useful in governing. And then you go back to the 60s, most legislation did not require a 60-vote supermajority.
Yeah. Okay, so let's sort of get to where we are now.
Yep.
How do you characterize the dysfunction now?
Let me say there was one other, combined, this is important, combined with the kind of changes in Republican congressional politics, you also have a different issue, which is interesting. A political scientist, Francis Lee, wrote about this. Since the 90s, we don't have stable majorities on Capitol Hill anymore. From the 30s,
what
really.
What makes a stable majority?
Meaning from the 30s to the 1990s, the Democrats controlled Congress almost the entire time, except for 2 sessions, and then the Senate in the Reagan years.
But is that a good thing?
Well, what it meant, so this is what it meant. I'm just talking procedurally. What it meant is Democrats had an incentive to give Republicans something in the process because they would not lose power by doing so. And Republicans wanted to deal with Democrats because if you didn't make a deal with the other party, you were out of power. So part of the phenomenon since the 90s, whether it's good or bad is one thing, but how it works is the parties are increasingly terrified of giving anything. Any concession can essentially lose power.
And you think that's a function of potentially losing power? I mean, the fact that you have Democrats in charge from the 1930s until 1994,
yep.
right? Except for a couple of
sessions.
To what extent does that not create this massive backlash where Republicans, want to earn back control and then hold it?
Well, it did.
Right?
I mean, it did. So, that was part of what drove
So why
Newt
does
Gingrich.
not having a stable majority sort of and the ebb and flow of power, why is that not more representative?
It's not better or worse, more representative or less. It's not conducive to a more contained kind of partisanship. It creates all the incentives for the most intense kind of strategy possible. And then you combine that with a party that is willing to go there, you get where we are today. And you see that play out right now. I mean,
How?
Well, right now we're going to have that in that you have the, I think, smallest majority in the House since 1931. So certainly Republicans are not going to want to do much that might give the Democrats back power.
Except for that they're going to have a debt limit debate.
And the debt limit's going to complicate it. And Democrats are certainly, except for in the Senate, Senator Fetterman for sure, but others might not want to kind of give too much to the Republicans. So you see very kind of simple mathematical incentives are going to take form right now. But on its own, that's not the issue. It's the layering of the two together that I think has been so explosive.
Okay. So to return to a responsible partisanship, yes. You review a certain set of reforms. These
yes.
reforms, in your view, are mostly congressional reforms.
Yes.
Again, so Congress will fix itself supposedly, or hopefully, aspirationally.
Yep.
What are some of them?
So that was the hardest chapter to write for this book, because that's not what I usually do. I'm like historian.
You look backwards, not forward.
I say, look what happened. All right, hand off to someone else. But my editor, Nick Lemon, who's right here somewhere, I see you right up there, said you need to do that at the end of a book. And it was actually a really good exercise. So some of what I focus on are procedural changes that I actually think will matter, and I characterize it as taking away the weapons of mass destruction, the worst tools that parties have used. And so one, going back to where we were earlier, I don't think the debt limit is actually very functional, useful, or necessary. We didn't have it for a large part of American history. It's a 20th century invention. And I don't think we need it, or we need some kind of reform where it can't be manipulated every time it comes up. There was, in 1979, Richard Gephardt, who was a Democrat, actually instituted the Gephardt rule, which allowed for an automatic increase if something happened. And it was removed.
Because we actually accidentally defaulted.
No, we did. It was more timing and kind of a delay. So he passes that. And then Mr. Gingrich is actually, when he becomes Speaker, that's one of the first things he gets rid of. So I have procedural reforms like that. I do have reforms that are very different. I talk about reforms that people are talking about that will better integrate voters and parties as organizations, from new kinds of town hall experiments that have been using technology to allow members to really speak much more and more frequently. I talk about the size of the House. I do believe the House should be increased because it would diminish the size of districts and allow for much more integration, voting rights. I talk about a whole set of what I call associational reforms. Connect parties so you feel more invested in the body. And a third, there's four. One is I talk about regular order, which both parties agree on. And it goes against parties. But it's to have a regular process so that members feel whatever the outcome, whoever the winner is, they actually had a role in the fight. And finally, the most amorphous, but the older I get and the more I see in Washington, the more I see norms of leadership matter. And when someone's willing to break those norms, it could have really debilitating effects. And so I call for normative leadership, which means we talk about transformative leaders, leaders who have big ideas, Reagan kind of leaders, and push the agenda in a new way. We have transactional leaders like George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton who are great at deal making. Yeah. And I call for normative, meaning leaders who prioritize the norms of our democratic governing. That is a priority to reestablish that. We need those leaders on Capitol Hill right now, desperately. And that's part of how you move to a different era. How that's all going to happen, I don't have an answer, Margaret. But look, the one thing I learned studying history is when you have periods like the Progressive Era or the 1970s where you have these bursts of reform, they're rare. You can't predict they're about to happen. Yeah. And they either happen because of a crisis, they happen because the dysfunction becomes too great. So the role of someone like me, I hope, is to just kind of put the argument out there and have it ready to go when that moment arises.
First question from an audience member. How does Biden's decision to step down fit into this? Does it suggest, a hope for a responsible partisanship among Democrats?
No. I do. In that last part, I talk about leaders who I do think ultimately aspired to new norms. I do think, for all the flaws and problems, I do think President Biden, when he started, that was one of the things he wanted to do. It was about how you govern, not simply what he was going to do. I think there's
he wanted to be more normative. Yeah,
normative, restrained. He was not going to go where his opposition was. I think Liz Cheney actually emerges as someone who's also fighting for that. But I think his stepping down, her being essentially kicked out of the party, don't bode well for where we are now. I don't think we are in a space where that kind of leadership has a lot of room.
How has the American political Overton window shifted alongside about partisanship? And I think that's... It's
a very useful concept. People hear the word, they don't really know what we're talking about. But it is about how expectations shift. So all of a sudden, expectations that were once not considered legitimate are routine. So on Congress, you see this all the time. The budget is now something that we don't even have long-term budgets anymore. We have abandoned that idea. Yeah. We have what's called a continuing resolution. We do a budget for every few months, and then we fight again. And that's now become the norm. If you talked about that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there were long-term budget decisions. Not everyone was happy with them, but you made that decision. We're not there. That's a case where all of a sudden this is now a focus rather than dealing with some of the bigger questions that we face. And then obviously, look, I think the Overton window has shifted on what's scandalous and what's not. And we talked about that with Wilbur Mills, and it's not simply personal issues. I do think we've entered a kind of realm where to do something scandalous, I don't really know what you have to do anymore to hit that point. And that's the window has shifted, and I think we're seeing that with, here, Congressman Gates, former Congressman Gates lost his seat. We'll see if he runs for governor.
But that's actually, there is a bottom
that's
somewhere.
So extreme. But that was my point.
But he didn't get to be AG,
yeah,
right?
But that's so extreme. I couldn't believe, that's where we are today.
Where we are.
It signals the shift, and he might run for governor. So that's an example. And then the other kind of issues that you hear become less focused on.
What is an example of an action or actions that Democrats could take to achieve healthy partisanship?
Well, look, I think there's a route, and I've argued this, where they can be pretty partisan in the next couple of years. What would that mean, being responsible? They can agree as a party, as they did with Speaker Pelosi, to vote the party line. They are not going to have defectors, and the party leaders have the right to make it clear. If you're going to work with the GOP in the next couple of years, you're not going to receive our support. That's your decision. And if you stay with us, we'll reward you. We'll help you with your campaigns. That's responsible partisanship. The Democratic leadership, to continue, can have a message that's very clear, very distinct from what the Republicans are arguing on issues like the economy, and really sell that message, fight for that message. Those are normal partisan tools that we could see the Democrats use, and I think it could be effective.
But, I mean, if we were to make that question the exact same but replace Democrat with Republican, are we not seeing a form, I mean, aren't we seeing healthy partisanship from Republicans in the sense that there is unanimity of message, there is adherence to leadership, there is, I mean, so would you call Trump's Republican coalition in Congress, or at least in the House of Representatives, because in the Senate there are some other dynamics and cross-currents, but at least in the House, healthy partisanship?
In what you just said, yes, but here's a difference. Some of that revolved around an agreement that we can deny the election results of a presidential election. That's not legitimate
So
unity.
you're saying it has to be consistent with the Constitution?
It has to be constitutional. It has to accept basic procedures. And that's not where the current...
So it's not just about adherence to party and operating in lockstep.
It has to be within the constitutional system that we have.
Got it. Okay, good.
But the elements you said, I'm not against, and I guess that's part of, I'm not against the party being on the same page, being tough with the other party. I don't see a problem with that. But the rest is integral to where the MAGA Republican Party is right now.
Are there any reforms then that the MAGA Republican Party can do that would help achieve a responsible partisanship short of...
Well,
I mean, it is just the crux of it in your analysis, adherence to the Constitution.
Well, interestingly, President Trump, before in the interregnum, actually pushed getting rid of the debt ceiling in that budget package. He just did it, though, that it would end when he was no longer president. So it kind of undercut the whole point of it. But you can see, yeah, I mean, I never say no in what can emerge. I do think, look, if former Congresswoman Cheney had kind of been able to retain her foothold in the party, I do think at some level she was fighting for some of this in her final days. So, but I'm not like an optimist. I'm not someone saying in the next few years you're going to see this, because the whole point is this is really deeply rooted in where the party philosophy is right now, coupled with a political system that facilitates it from money to media.
Well, I mean, we haven't talked about media, the role of media and digital media in particular in sort of the amping up of this hyper-partisan environment. But the other piece is, you know, perhaps the solutions to Congress actually aren't in the Congress itself, but are in the electoral system, which is embedded in each of the states. I mean, there is an argument that closed partisan primaries actually create an environment where people like Liz Cheney can't return because she has to go home and face a MAGA primary base that won't ever return her to office. And we saw that play out. So to what extent is the answer actually not in the Congress, but in the states?
It's part. I mean, I do talk in there in the reforms on districting changes and...
You're talking about ranked choice voting as
well? There's two. So there's a creation of nonpartisan, bipartisan commissions to craft districts. Then there's different kinds of votings where you can have coalitions, essentially, ranked choice and others. The problem is that's just the House of Representatives. So first, it doesn't explain all of partisanship. The Senate and presidential politics don't really have an effect by that. Nor do I think if you just change that, you're inevitably going to transform congressional elections, even in the House. So I like it. I think those are experiments that are important. I think they might create kind of checks against the worst intensity. But on their own, I think people put them up on a pedestal as the solution. And I think even if it happened, it will be limited. So you still need inside of Congress as well.
There has been a lot of social science research about how phones and digital media and social media have impacted just the mental health of teens. You can only imagine how it's impacted the behavior of members of Congress. So what is the role of social media and X now and all of these various functions? I mean, obviously, it's profound, but I presume this factors into how you think partisanship expresses itself.
Yeah, I mean, profound is a nice way to say it. It's utterly destructive. I mean, I've come to the conclusion that it's hard not to see it that way. It's created a filterless information system where anything not only can get out, meaning there's no gatekeepers in information, but it can get out quickly. And I think you can't have a politics where there's no public comments. It's not just that there's siloed news, it's also filterless news. And I think that is the atmosphere in which this Congress is working, and it kind of pushes the worst part of it and makes it very hard. I always tell my students, in the 60s, the debate was on Vietnam. Should we have troops in Vietnam or should we withdraw troops? If you had a debate like that today, some people are saying when there's troops on the ground, nothing's happening in Vietnam. There's no war. You don't even have the basics. And so in that kind of atmosphere, and then all the other kinds of conspiratorial arguments, I think that needs to be addressed. And that's not a congressional decision. I do think that's a whole other story about institutions of media and information. And I do think, one last thing, I'm sorry, the kind of Elon Musk, President Trump, X alliance is a real dramatic step up of all of this.
It's an escalation.
An escalation, because it's not only the mechanism that has problems, now the person who heads the mechanism has a very clear political
He has a desk in the West Wing.
Yeah.
Actually, the executive office building.
So that's a big story.
Okay, so the next question is, what role do you think the media should have in this?
Yeah, I mean, look, the media, a lot of the media is good, and I think the role of the media remains what it's been certainly since the early 20th century. And the more there can be pushback in certain parts of the media to provide grounded information, the more you get back to a public commons where two strong parties are agreeing, like with normal rules of politics, normal information. I would love a vigorous debate over how do you deal with issues of climate change. That's a kind of legitimate debate, rather than a debate where a lot of people are just kind of throwing the concept out altogether.
So you're insisting on a fact-based debate where people
I think
agree
that's
on
good
the
for
facts.
democracy, yes.
Yeah.
And the founders there, they would agree.
So this is a question from the audience, which I think follows well. The U.S. isn't the only country with such animosity between parties. What is it about our current moment that is causing this?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not just the current moment again. Certainly in the U.S., this has been going on for decades. And so there's certain commonalities. The media, as an example, sticking with that, is a commonality. I mean, that is what is interesting about social media and the internet. It's not nationally based, other than in certain countries such as China, where you have severe censorship. But I think that's working in a lot of countries. Part of it is issue-based. I do think there's this ongoing struggle and debate over the economy and the way the economy has unfolded. And then part of it's particular to different countries. I think just because things are happening that are similar all over the world doesn't make the uniqueness of how it's happened here very relevant.
Do you think partisanship compromises our reliability as a foreign partner and ally?
No, it's not partisanship that does that. Look, the high point of the Cold War was a Democratic Party working with Senator Vandenberg, who was a Republican. I'm talking about Harry Truman and the Democratic Party. But the party was very strong then. And this was part of the agenda, this kind of commitment to liberal internationalism. And they fought back against old guard Republicans like Robert Taft. And the system became enduring. I think a strong party system can be just as appealing and intimidating overseas, both to adversaries and allies, as a dysfunctional, either hyper-partisan system or a system where the parties won't stand for anything. And no one can understand where they're going in the next election cycle. That's just as dangerous, frankly, if not more.
Does responsible partisanship mean an end to third-way liberalism? Would that be a good thing?
No, I mean, not necessarily. Third-way liberalism, I assume the question refers to a Bill Clinton. You can have a very strong Democratic Party built around Clintonian democratic ideas. So no, I don't think this is kind of excluding that at all.
Oh,
and the good thing, that depends on your political perspective.
I'm gonna do the dark question, and then we'll end hopefully. Do you think Americans still believe in democracy?
Yes, I do. I mean, some don't believe how much care it needs or don't really want to focus on that. I think many assume it's an automatic at some level. You can get really deep in the bad and the democracy will survive. That's not believing in it, it's taking it for granted. And I think there's more of that today, and that's dangerous. There's some who probably don't, there are some who don't believe in it. But look, maybe I'm too optimistic. I don't think that's a majority of the country. I think that belief is very strong. But that belief on its own doesn't mean that much. In the end, it means, what do you do with that? What do you tolerate? What don't you tolerate?
Which party today has the best chance to create an enduring governing majority?
Neither. And I mean that, look, I mean
Why?
that.
Why?
I mean, and it doesn't mean a party can't be in a good place. I think, for example, the Republicans are in a very good place after this election politically. They expanded their coalition, they won the swing states, but this isn't an era where we don't have the landslide elections of 84, of 72, of 30. This is just the reality of a very polarized electorate. So the majorities, I think, parties are going to have in the near future are slim majorities. And the electorate just doesn't move that much.
So I know you're a historian, you're good at looking back, not prognosticating forward, but based on how you understand this hyper-partisan climate that we're in, what do you foresee for the next decade or two?
2 decades, I don't know. But if I'm using the whole COVID pandemic as my kind of metric, not great things. Because if you had asked me 20 years ago what shakes us out of this, out of a difficult moment, I'd say a crisis of huge magnitude, like Vietnam and Watergate were.
Right.
That shakes incumbents finally, and it creates political pressure to change.
And it did shake an incumbent.
It did, but it didn't shake the system.
For a minute.
Yeah,
like
and it didn't shake
years.
the system. And that was pretty remarkable. We're pretty much in 2025 where we were in 2019. So I don't think in the near future we'll have that. But I think there's ways without the most dramatic debates about, and this is kind of part of the book, getting rid of parties all of a sudden after many, many years of having this. Versus all-in parties and not caring, just all-out warfare. There's something in the middle, and I think that's where there has to be a political opening. How do you fix what we have? How do you make it stronger so that it reflects these differences? But I don't know when that happens. I can't tell you.
But so if the answer is in the middle, right?
Yeah.
If the antidote to the extremism on both sides is some kind of a
not centrism, a kind of partisanship that's in the middle.
So you're not a bipartisanship then?
No.
Okay.
A partisanship with guardrails. I come back to that opening argument where there are limits on what the party leaders can do. It's like another thing I tell my students, imagine you have 2 parties and they're playing chess. And each one has a strategy to win. One team is figuring out how's the other person going to move, what's the next thing they're thinking of doing. Then the other team takes the board and just throws it on the floor and says, I win. Responsible partisanship is getting back to 2 players playing the chess, wanting to win, but agreeing that the board has to stay in place, the pieces have to stay in place, and the rules of chess can't just be jettisoned. And that's where you get back to what I'm talking about.
Okay. I mean, it begs a final question. I mean, you talk about asymmetric polarization. You talk about how one party is not operating within the confines of an understanding of the Constitution. When you have this kind of asymmetric polarization, what does one do about one party that doesn't seem to have the same kind of guardrails as the other party?
Well, I don't think the answer is to replicate it. That's when you get, well, there are some who want to do that. I mean, that is a debate that certainly has had, and it's a debate that's taken place within the Republican Party too. And there, I think more people have accepted at least this kind of politics. So I think you have to use all other means possible to try to win back power. And 2 things that are still very true. It is this polarized electorate. Winning back power does not require the Herculean effort that it took Democrats to win in the 1930s, or Republicans to win either in 80 or 1994. So there is room to be effective, to be politically sophisticated, to be very tough, kind of, I'd say again, Pelosi style, and to win back control without saying we're just going to go all in on what the other team is doing. The other thing that can happen, and this is not in the next 2 years, but I still think if you had sustained losses in the Republican Party, and a lot of Republicans were feeling that might be where they're moving. They didn't. But in a partisan system, that's what shakes a party, losing. I don't think, actually, a lot of Republicans are totally loyal to Trump. They're loyal to the fact Trump can bring them power. And so if that is broken, I think that's where you'll enter into another space. But Democrats have to just kind of play by hardball, but reasonable and constitutional politics. I think that's a legitimate thing for the party to do.
All right. On that hopeful note, Julian Zelizer, thank you for the book.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kat Schwartz. I'm Director of Public Programs here at the New York Historical, and we were thrilled to welcome you, as well as both of our speakers, Margaret Hoover and Julian Zelizer. I do want to remind everyone that we have signed copies of Julian Zelizer's book for sale in our museum store on the 77th Street side of the building, so we hope to see you there. And until then, please join me in giving a final round of applause to both of our speakers.